Have you ever found yourself in a rush heading home from the office to try and make it in time for your son's baseball game or daughter's dance recital? When, to your surprise, a distracted or equally as rushed driver cuts in front of you, derailing you from your destination and your thought process? Welcome to Group One's ethical analysis of the practice of airlines overbooking flights. To begin our analysis, we'll look at a raw cell phone footage of Flight 3411 from United Airlines, wherein passenger Dr. David Dow was on his way in a rush to his destination to treat his patients and clients the following day, only to be forcibly removed from his seat that he had paid for and instead replaced by United Airlines' own passengers. Let's take a look.
Let's drive to Louisville. It's not right. Can't the pilots drive to Louisville? Can't they rent a car for the pilots and have them drive? Rent a car for the pilots and have them drive? Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my!
Hey, come on. Come on.
Oh, this is wrong. Oh my God! Look at what you did to him! Oh my God! My God! No!
My
Guys,
God!
my God! What are you doing? No way!
Come on. There you go.
Oh, this is
busted his
wrong.
lip.
Oh my God! Look at what you did to him! Oh my God! Oh my God!
Good work. Way to go.
This is horrible.
Unfortunately, gets walked off.
Oh my
Yeah, the police grabbed the guy.
Jesus!
He's an older doctor. He wouldn't get off the plane.
Oh my
And so they forced him off.
I have to go home. 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 I have to.
As you can see, Dr. Dow was equally in a rush to make it home and was, as I mentioned, derailed from his destination. So as we look and consider the ethical practice or ethical behavior associated with the airline's practice of overbooking flights, we'd like to consider or propose these few questions from the onset. Is the practice in and of itself ethical? Is it legally, morally, or ethically acceptable? And when overbooking occurs, how do airlines respond? And what about the actions that we saw there in Flight 3411? Now, the reason that airlines overbook flights is to compensate for those passengers who do not show up. When the airplane's passenger capacity is not full, the company is going to experience or seems to experience significant losses. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation, the DOT, overbooking is not illegal. However, the DOT has specific rules that require that airlines seek out volunteers to be left behind if it appears that the flight has been oversold. You may recall from your own personal travels, the desk agent comes across the speaker asking for volunteers who are willing to accept a travel voucher to forfeit their seat on that given flight. So passengers can also find themselves at times in a financial loss if they are bumped from their seats because they've got to come up with a hotel accommodations or additional travel or meal expenses that can be incurred, and not to mention the stiff, cold airport floor that they may have to find themselves sleeping on until the next flight. When passengers are bumped involuntarily, airlines are required by the DOT to provide the passenger with a written statement explaining their rights and how the airline will determine who gets on a flight that is overbooked. So to help us with our analysis of this overbooking flights problem, and certainly in 2017, when this event of United Flight Airline 3411 took to the news of Dr. David Dow, questions began to swirl about whether this type of practice was ethical or not. And so as a team here, we have put together a presentation to take us through the ethical analysis, specifically around evaluating what groups will benefit, what groups will be harmed, whose rights will be exercised, whose rights will be ignored, and then we'll propose a way to express the moral problem in the form of a question. In other words, is it right that airlines are allowed to overbook their flights? We'll consider the economic benefits associated with this practice, the legal requirements, and of course the ethical duties as well. So what groups will benefit? Certainly the airlines benefit by filling more seats. They simply overbook because there are times when passengers simply don't show up. The passengers that take the compensation or the travel vouchers that are extended to them for volunteering to get bumped also benefit. Of course, the shareholders of the airlines benefit because of the increased profits that are generated associated with this practice. And then the employees who are put on a flight in place of the passengers that are bumped, they too benefit, as in the case with Dr. Dow. On the right-hand side is a small graphic that illustrates the monetary value of compensation for passengers that were bumped from flights due to overbookings in 2016. Noticeably, towards the bottom fourth of this list is, in fact, United Airlines at $570 and some change dollars. So what groups will be harmed? The passengers that bought the flights and had their plans ruined by having to miss their flight, their families that were eagerly anticipating them perhaps on the other side of their destination to spend time with them or to carry on with their vacation plans would be harmed. In the case of Flight 3411, this passenger, Dr. Dow, was physically injured. You could see from the blood at his lips and being dragged across the airplane floor. And then also the group being harmed here are the competing airlines of the same routes who could be using or carrying those passengers that are bumped, but they're unable to because they've been left behind and offered some form of nominal travel voucher. On the right-hand side is the number of passengers compensated per 10,000 passengers at each of these airlines. And so noticeably, again, here at the top is United Airlines, is 7.2 passengers per 10,000 passengers that have been bumped and harmed as a result of this practice. So whose rights will be exercised? As we consider this here, the rights of those individuals or groups are identified here as the airlines who maximize their capacity and generate higher revenues by overbooking their flights. Their rights are simply exercised without a problem, without a doubt. The security officers who were called upon to remove this man, Dr. Dow, from the flight, their rights are exercised. They're fulfilling their duty as law enforcement agents. And so their rights are certainly exercised, and they're able to carry forth what their responsibilities are. The ticket agents there who book the tickets, their rights are also being exercised. They're fulfilling their responsibility and commitments to their employer. United Airlines does have the right to remove these passengers, and so their rights are also being exercised in this case. And then the CEO, Mr. Munoz, his rights are being exercised because he's the one that allows or employs this policy of overbooking flights without any cause or concern for the passengers. So whose rights are ignored? Well, the passengers, of course, that were taking off of the flight, that are actually being left behind at the airport, left to call their families or clients that they're unable to make the business meeting or family travel plans. Of course, the public perception of the airline becomes tainted because of these types of incidences and these types of traumatic events that take place on the airline, and then are published through social media channels and other media sources across the internet. The stakeholders who United Airlines shares that lost value. So their shareholders, these rights were ignored. And then the passengers who witnessed this traumatic event, perhaps some small children or others that were on there that didn't have to, but were a part of that simply because of the airline's choice to forcibly remove and overbook and oversell this flight. So what is the moral problem here? As we try and state this in a form of a question, here are three illustrations to ask ourselves. Is it right that an airline can sell what it does not have? In other words, it does not have those seats. They've already sold them. They no longer have them. Is it right that they continue to sell what they don't have? Is it right that an airline can involuntarily remove paying customers to make room for their own employees, as in the case of Dr. Dow? And is it right that each airline can dictate the percentage of seats to oversell versus having a federal regulation or federal regulated percentage that it can oversell? So as we continue down the path of evaluating the ethical sense of this behavior, we also need to consider the economic benefits associated with this practice of overbooking flights. So the airline maximizes its profits when they are at overcapacity, at or over capacity. So there's an economic benefit to the airline there to maximize its revenues. And so passengers can sometimes be profitably compensated in the form of a ticket voucher or other form of compensation by giving up a seat. So there's an economic benefit to those passengers that it actually works out for and has the flexibility to stay behind in their destination. And then another economic benefit that we see is airline travelers in general, because overbooking does, in fact, keep airfares low. It keeps the competition of prices still in the forefront, and so this drives prices down, or at least keeps them moderately affordable. So what are the legal requirements associated with this practice? Well, overbooking is, in fact, legal. Again, the DOT does not say they cannot do it. They just have to find volunteers to be willing to relinquish their seat. So it is not an illegal practice. Airlines must seek out volunteers, as I mentioned, and then airlines are not legally bound to a specific compensation amount to give to those passengers who are, in fact, bummed. And then airlines can establish their own seating priorities, as you sometimes see in different airline carriers, Southwest versus, say, Delta or otherwise. So then what are the ethical duties? Well, one of them is the actual self-interest associated with the airlines. The airlines are making a decision based solely on their bottom line. In other words, they felt justified in their action to remove David Dow, who had paid for his flight home to serve his clients the very next day in his medical practice. And instead, the airline felt their bottom line was more important than the lives or families of those that he would be treating. And of course, the act of booking, although it is legal, has negative outcomes for passengers while preserving the airline's interest to stay in business. So how can airlines help change this practice? They can modify the algorithm that is used to identify how many seats to oversell. They can cut back on those number of seats. They can give the ticket agents or the gate agents the authority to negotiate the compensation associated with those who volunteer to be bumped from their flights. They can send a text or an email message to the passengers notifying them that there is a desire for volunteers, and perhaps put a bidding process in place to allow for them to identify or find what that compensation might be. They can become more transparent with their overbooking policies to allow for passengers to know what their chances are of missing a particular flight or volunteering, rather than waiting for them to arrive at the gate and be in the process of boarding before they intercom announces that there is an overbooking or oversold flight issue. And lastly, airlines can simply take the higher road and differentiate themselves from a competitive advantage by saying, we simply don't overbook flights. We will honor every one of our passengers' travel destination and tickets that they have sold or purchased. So in conclusion, overbooking is a questionable practice that has existed for a long time as a way to maximize the profits of these large airline businesses. Simply because of the no-showing passengers, they want to maximize those. So it's understandable. It is not illegal to overbook. However, in the case and in the example and video we saw of Dr. David Dow, it is not ethical. It's not right to abuse your passenger so that you can replace him with your own employee. Airlines should recognize that their moral obligation is to the passenger rather than their bottom line. And airlines can also implement practices to decrease the amount of passengers affected by overbooking by being more transparent and getting a hold of them from the onset to communicate and allow for other types of offerings and compensation opportunities and flexibility from the beginning. Now, it's been said that to save one life is to save the world entirely. And in this case of Dr. David Dow, United Airlines Flight 3411, rather, where he's trying to make it home to his passenger, to his medical practice, you could say that to save a flight is also to save a life entirely, because that's exactly what he was trying to do as a medical professional.